Judges Corner is brought to you by CoolStuffInc.com and GatheringMagic.com. Support our show by visiting both websites. Now it's time for Judges Corner with David Green.
Welcome back to Judges Corner. In today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at Dragon's Maze. Dragon's Maze is the third and final set in the Return to Ravnica block, which features all 10 previously seen guild mechanics, along with a new mechanic seen on an older type of card, a split card, called Fuse. Fuse is a keyworded mechanic that we covered in our previous episode. You can learn more about it by taking a look at that episode. So, we're going to highlight a couple of cards that we think are confusing to newer players and older players alike, such as our first example, Blood Scrivener. Blood Scrivener is a 2-1 for 2 that says, if you would draw a card while you have no cards in hand, instead draw 2 cards and lose 1 life. So the first question that comes up is, what if I have more than one in play? Say 2 of them in play, with no cards in hand. The end result is going to be you'll draw 3 cards and lose 2 life. If you have 3 in play, you'll draw 4 cards and lose 3 life. The reasoning for this is because we have replacement effects applying to other replacement effects, and I could go into detail about this, but that would probably take an entire episode all on its own discussing replacement and prevention effects and their interactions, so we're going to save that for another episode. In our next example, we have a Scrivener in play and we play a Sign in Blood with no cards in hand. When the Sign in Blood goes to resolve, we're going to end up drawing 3 cards and losing 3 life, 2 from the Sign in Blood and 1 from the Scrivener. So in our final example, we have a Scrivener in play and 1 life, and we play our only card in hand, Sphinx's Revelation, for, say, x equals 4. When the Sphinx's Revelation goes to resolve, do we die? Do we live? What exactly happens? So what ends up happening is we resolve everything on the Sphinx's Revelation in the order that it's written. So we gain the life first, gaining 4 life, putting us at 5, and then we draw the cards, replacing the first draw with draw 2, lose 1. So the end result is we have 5 cards in hand and we're sitting at 4 life. Our next card is Feral Animist, which is a 2-1 for 3 that reads, pay 3 generic mana and it gets plus X plus O until end of turn, where X is its power. So basically, if you pay 3 mana into it, it becomes a 4-1. If instead you pay 6, it becomes an 8-1, and so on and so forth. But what happens if its power is negative, such as through Agoraphobia? And what if it's a -3-1? Well, if you activate its effect, it's actually going to become a -6-1. And if you activate it again, it'll become a -12-1. So our next card is Master of Cruelties, and man has this card been cruel to players. Whenever it attacks, it can only attack alone, which means if this card is declared as an attacker, it can only attack by itself. Or if you have a creature that has to attack every turn, that means Master of Cruelties can't attack that turn. Whenever Master of Cruelties attacks a player and isn't blocked, that player's life total becomes 1. Master of Cruelties assigns no combat damage this turn. That's really important for a couple of things. For starters, if we attack a Planeswalker, the effect doesn't trigger at all. Second, the effect triggers when it isn't blocked, not when it attacks. So a really cool example with this card would be, what happens if I attack with it, it doesn't get blocked, its effect triggers and puts my opponent to 1, and my opponent thinks it's not going to deal damage to it, but then I ninjutsu it with an Ink Eyes. When this happens, Ink Eyes is going to come into play attacking, and then deal damage to my opponent, killing them with Ink Eyes. Unless, of course, they have some way to handle Ink Eyes. So our final example is Progenitor Mimic, which is basically a clone that lets us make copies of the clone at the beginning of each of our upkeeps. So Progenitor Mimic reads, you may have Progenitor Mimic enter the battlefield as a copy of any creature on the battlefield, except it gains at the beginning of your upkeep. If this creature isn't a token, put a token onto the battlefield that's a copy of this creature. That can become a little confusing, like what happens about the tokens themselves? Do they produce tokens? And the answer, of course, is no. Or what happens if we copy a token with the original Mimic? Well, let's say we do that and we copy a 3/3 Centaur token. Fortunately for us, the original Mimic that's copying the Centaur is going to be able to produce other Centaur tokens, and this is because when we copy the Centaur, it doesn't actually become a token itself, it just copies all of the characteristics on that token. The fact that it's a token only means that the card isn't a real Magic card, while the Progenitor Mimic that originally copied it actually is a real Magic card, so it can continue to produce more Centaurs. Another question that might come up is, what if you play another Mimic copying the Mimic that's copying the Centaur token? Well, if you do this, the new Mimic's going to have 2 instances of the triggered effect. This is because when you copy something that grants something through copying, it becomes a copyable characteristic of the card when you go to copy it with something else. So the new Mimic is going to have 2 instances of the triggered effect. The old one has 1 instance, netting us 3 new Centaur tokens at the beginning of each of our upkeeps. So this concludes today's episode, highlighting a couple of cards from Dragon's Maze. We hope to have another episode where we'll review even more questions about Dragon's Maze cards and mechanics, and the interaction of them between the entire Return to Ravnica block as a whole. If If you have any questions of your own, make sure to send them to us at judgescorner@gatheringmagic.com. And until next time, enjoy your pre-release, may all your coins land on heads, and have fun.